part of designing or managing a portfolio is not actually to just spread out your eggs, your projects, your relationships, but actually to know where in the system do you need to place them so that you can make sense of the emergent constellations, leverage those, and that you can make change where it matters. I think when we talk about systems change, sometimes this isn't the system is just one big thing, but it actually is also about finding the right place for change. Where will the change stick? Where will it actually have the right resources, capabilities, and intents to actually transform into something that lasts? And so if we think of portfolios as troves of experiences, relevant context experiences with the problem, then your portfolio really becomes the soil for learning in an organization. And portfolios, therefore, can be understood as integral learning mechanisms in any types of organizations. Be that, agriculture is a problem, be that governance, be that how does a country develop, or also how do I get my customers, how do I open up a new customer landscape for myself? There really is a learning mechanism irrespective of the problem that you're actually engaging, be that yourself or an external type of problem. And if we think of portfolios and our experiences as those troves of learning, troves of experiences, then we need a mechanism to actually go in there and extract the learning from those experiences and make this learning available to a collective organization, the human system. And in a way that makes sense, that it's usable, and that you can draw from there a sense of renewal and take decisions. And this is where sense-making comes in, and why that is at the heart of our foundation, both in terms of a leadership capability, but also as a social process and as a structural element of organizations. Without going into detail right now what sense-making is, what it looks like, really think of sense-making as an opportunity for a team to create space, to almost stop and pause action to make sense of action. And it's an opportunity to literally start and zoom out and start to practice big picture thinking, but particularly to almost try and have different types of conversations about our experiences, which are not about monitoring and evaluating the success of any single one initiative, but actually understanding how we as a system are coherent with our intent, what we want to make happen. What are we learning about the context of our experiences and of what we're trying to make happen here? And where do we see the need to adjust, to adapt? Where are opportunities for us to make something different about ourselves so that we can be different out there and be more effective out there? And really think of sense-making in terms of kind of what happens to information in a sense-making workshop. It's really about the extraction, but also about the interpretation. Because people need meaning, and they need shared meaning to move into action. And that's something that sense-making does. Moreover, the way that we design it, and a strategic designer from our team would have millions of different ways how a sense-making workshop can be designed. But it follows a couple of key principles. And one of those principles are always about actually separating out the signals and the noise, to actually start to zoom away and to abstract, to start and manage in a different way complexity and uncertainty that people are in. And actually separating that out, the signals from the noise, is not a very easy process. Humans need a lot of help to do that. They need reference materials, reference points, artifacts, reminders of what actually matters here, and frames that help them to literally extract what matters. And so finally, that's the last key concept. So sense-making as a process follows three phases. In each one of the phases, there's a portfolio, a sense-making intelligence phase. And they are designed in such a way that they layer action, sense-making, and intelligence, and that they add and create value together. And if you do this over time, iteratively, let's say you do this once every quarter, then sense-making actually becomes a way to manage your activities, to manage your presence as an organization, and to learn from that. And if transformation is actually about taking new types of decisions, radical decisions at the edge of systems, then you need good intelligence to take such decisions, right? And you need intelligence that is often really emergent that is maybe sometimes doesn't even have a real language to it yet. It's something as you speak, it comes to you. And it's typically intelligence that will sit between many different experiences and between many different people. And so if you get into the habit of actually dynamically managing a portfolio of interventions, you have access to that. So we think that in that sense, sense making is one of the key steps or key enablers of taking decisions in support of system transformation. So that gives you a little bit of context from where I come from and some of the core kind of tenets of our work. Now let's move a little bit closer to Malawi, to the actual case study. So in Malawi, we worked with an organization called UNDP, United Nations Development Program. We'll be well familiar with them. And they're part of the UN Global Nations team, and really there to help governments in the developing world to develop and to be kind of active agents of their own development, mediating between the global UN agenda and the agenda of every individual country. And so Malawi is one of them, and we worked with the UNDP Country Office team that was specifically working on the governance portfolio. So they are structured, and when we started, they have been structured like that, still are, in two portfolios. One is the Resilient Growth Portfolio, the other one is the RISE Portfolio, which stands for Resilient Institutions and Engaged Civil Society. So I'll continue calling that the Governance Portfolio. That's really where the case study starts. Malawi is a country, I'm not going to speak too much about it, but there's a couple of patterns about it. It has been and continues to be one of the least developed countries in the world. If you look at the Human Development Index, any other types of indexes about governance or government performance, about transparency or just people development, they'll be in that last percentile throughout. They have had for decades social unrest because of corruption scandals. They've had just a change of leadership, of government leadership in the last year, and had very contested and social elections and social unrest about it. And those are just a couple of things to situate the problem of governance in Malawi. And for the UNDP, as for many other development organizations, governance is actually one of the key accelerators of development for nations that have kind of continuously been failing to that extent to develop and put their resources in the right spots. So if we now zoom into the governance portfolio, in 2019, when we started working with Malawi, it comprised about 9 programs. Some of these are projects, some of these are programs. And they were looking to achieve the 3 effects that you can see here. So really working towards accountable institutions, whereby they thought of accountability primarily as accountability to the citizens. So how can the government, the service implementers, partners of the government, be more transparent and more accountable to people? They're also looking for opportunities to actually bring in people more into the government space and into decision-making, into shared discourse about what matters, and into kind of the demand side of good governance. And this is where specifically NGOs and other civil society organizations mattered. And finally, they were really working on helping and capacitating the government to deliver on their promises, what they call the implementation of services. So moving kind of from the policy cycle, from the idea and the policy to make something happen, all the way through the actual service and the actual kind of user public service interaction that makes a service happen. So when we started working with them, we structured our approach according to 3 key needs that we found out and have agreed on with the senior leadership. So the very first thing that the senior leadership team was concerned about was projects. And projects constituted always and still do for many organizations, so the main way of actually being present in the problems that they're engaging with and being effective. But at the same time, projects have limitations, programmatic limitations, kind of scale limitations that make it actually very difficult to work in between projects and across issues. And governance being particularly a cross-cutting issue, almost kind of fell through the cracks, if you will. They also wanted to explore more how the team can take a learning approach to governance problems and really start to be more experimental and more curious about what's possible in governance. And that's where very often actual organizations don't have terms of reference that help their team members or partners to move into this exploration or curiosity space. They of course have strategy, documents, materials, all of that from the country, from the UN, from the UNDP. But those are typically materials that are serving exploitation or the implementation of a project, but not so much the exploration approach. And that exploration part is actually quite necessary if you want to have your team to work and understand how their work is feeding into governance change at a larger scale, to have this coordinated action that cuts across projects. And the final thing that they were grappling with was the sense that they were slow, not just the UNDP in Malawi, but I guess any type of organization looking to create systems change will always be grappling with how slow things actually go. And one of their sense was that it was slow because of the silos of the governance space. Things kept getting stuck, and they understood that they didn't really have an approach to the governance system as a social system with people, mindsets, behaviors, habits that needed changing, because they tended to work in projects, and projects tend to have a shelf life and end. And they understood that if they want to accelerate, it's actually that latter part that they need to watch out for and build a capability to measure that, pay attention to that, and engage at that in a human mindset and behavioral way. So that gets us to the actual project. As I said, we started in 2019. The last kind of part of the project ended in 2021. Overall, we worked with the UNDP, with the senior management team, the portfolio team of the governance portfolio for 17 months, quite closely. And if I just zoom out, I would say you could structure this whole collaboration to 3 steps. The first one was to run portfolio sense making for the very first time, really drawing on all of the projects that you saw there in the beginning, the 9 projects that they already had, to make sense of that. And really just to have a first experience of what does it mean to have a different type of conversation together about learning from our work. In the second step, we then used the outcomes of that to actually design new experiences that were specifically designed for, not just for impact, but literally for learning at the edges of those governance systems. And in the last project, we then moved into dynamic management. So how do we actually do this ongoingly and build an organizational habit around this? And I guess the beauty of this experience is actually that we're able to design sense making in many different ways, at many different scales, and we can see and layer the effects of that over time and build on that with the teams. Let's go into the portfolio sense making experience. So the very first portfolio sense making that we've done was a week-long engagement with the team on the ground. And that was actually the first and the last time that we all met in person, because right after that, soon after that, COVID happened, and the rest of the project actually had to be done remotely, completely, which at that time no one thought would have been possible, frankly, because we tend to think that strategic conversations and building a shared sense and understanding are so complex, we need to build them in person, in the team. And they were underestimating the extent to which a structured approach to sense making can be also done online. And so here you see the team in a circle. If we are in person, we literally put everyone in a circle. They have boards, they have post-it notes, things where they can take notes. But that's all. There's literally nothing else in the room. There might be, as you can see in the background, reference materials that we've created to actually help people to capture some meaning and build a shared understanding of what is it that we're talking about. So you can see one of, I think, 6 words in the background. So as I said, the very first sense-making experience actually really just allowed the team to have a different type of conversation, to get out of the habit of reporting when you're talking about your project, because reporting doesn't help you to make sense of your experience at all. What you can see here is a visual is taken from the UNDP Protocol for Sensemaking, which we've applied here in this project and in many others, which follows this three-step process. There's first the portfolio phase, where you design together the experience of sensemaking. You prepare for that. You prepare the types of voices, the types of presentations, reference materials that you bring into the room, but also the strategic frames through which you listen and extract the core insights. Then there's the actual sensemaking workshop, and then there's an intelligence generation piece. And in the intelligence generation workshop, that's typically a smaller team of strategic designers who have been involved in the portfolio design phase, with maybe some key decision makers who are actually then together taking out the key insights, finding the key patterns with their observations, and then drafting strategic arguments for the organization to make this or that move, to make this or that change to themselves. And it ends with a presentation of all of that by the team to their senior leadership. What this did in the end was that it created for a first time for the team a shared understanding of what governance actually means. Because and this is one of those problems that probably the more you work with it, the longer you work with it, it becomes a black box, because you have such an assumption of what you're talking about, and sometimes it's a taboo to ask certain types of questions even, and to ask, well, when you say engaged citizens, what do you actually mean by that? Who is an engaged citizen? Who's not an engaged citizen? So what this also allowed us then to do, and in the background, was to use sensemaking to produce what we call terms of reference, systemic terms of reference for coherence and wayfinding throughout. Because sensemaking is, of course, it definitely creates kind of an ad hoc sense of orientation, relevance, coherence. And it almost helps you to position yourself relative to the system that you're in. Where are you standing? What are you doing? What could you be doing? But it's almost not enough to actually allow you to work in complexity and stay in this exploration. We actually need a way to constantly visualize for ourselves the system that we work in. And again, in such a way that we are separating out noise and signal. So what you see here in the back is what we would call a system canvas. You can almost think of it as a problem space that represents in the multidimensionality a problem that a team is working on. And we have many of those. Some of those are about trust. Some of these are about waste ecosystems in cities. Some of these are about governance in Malawi, like here. And some of these will be about tourism or climate or the future of work. And what they do, and I'm not going to go into how do you make one, what's in them, but really think of them as actually allowing you to represent a problem as a multidimensional complex whole. And as a space where you have, on account of where you are positioning yourself, you have different types of opportunities, resources, experiences available to you. So that really allows you to have a different type of conversation when you talk about purpose, when you talk about vision, when you talk about effects. You actually start to link that up to how is the system functioning and where are we in that system to enable it to change. And finally, once you have something like that, of course you don't want to just stare at an empty cube, but you actually use this constantly to update and visualize for you, for the team, for the people that you're working with, where you are in the problem and where you're not. What's your rationale of being in the different parts of the problem? At what level of the problem are you engaging? How much of the work that you're doing is actually kind of probably down here, which will be probably about collecting information, making information available, or adding new resources to the system? And how much of that work is actually about paradigms? How much of that work is about behavior, is about meaning, is about identities? So it provides you with a way to visualize for yourself in a different way, in a more strategic way. Where are you not? And what does actually matter? What's of matter to you in this point in time? So this is another picture of the intelligence generation workshop. So this is really the end of a 5-day engagement with the team on the ground. And you can see them taking pictures from what we call claims. It's almost like the last step where they're actually writing up what is the observation? What are we claiming is important right now? How do we support our observation? And what are next steps from here? What can we actually take? And the idea here is that they're not coming out of sense making with solutions, but they're actually coming up with a sense of possibilities. Literally saying, this is where we stand right now. This is what we see. This is what we assumed would happen. This is what's actually happening. And now we have this new range of possibilities available to us. And that's something not any single person or single project can actually do. You need that collective intelligence, if you want to call it that way, to actually get that shared sense of possibility and create that. Because it's, and in fact, you don't get it. You need to create it together as a social system. Okay, so that gets us to the second step, the portfolio design phase. And I'm going to bother you with this problems-based representation for a little bit more. So what that allowed us to do, once we had an understanding of where is the portfolio positioning itself, where not, what are the emergent constellations, and what are those leverage points or acupuncture points in the system, we're then actually started to create new strategic positions. What you can see here are the new strategic positions for the portfolio. So we actually sat together and went through a portfolio design process with the team, where we said, this is where you're now, this is what you're learning, and where else would you want to position yourself? Not knowing the solution just now, but just knowing that something about this matters. There's structurally something at stake here. And we designed, out of these three positions, you can see there's something that we call lateral capability, and there's the green one, that's the horizontal accountability, and the yellow one is the vertical accountability. And without even knowing what that is about, it gives you already a sense of actually just the types of decisions that you're taking. Are you playing within the problem? Are you starting to play at the edges, outside of the problem? Where does influence come from? And actually from all of these three positions, the government has three flagship projects that came out from these positionings and from the project designs that happened subsequently. So for each position, we designed 2 projects, and from those 6 projects, the 3 projects became key flagship projects of the government. One is on the lateral capability side, that's about bringing foresight and climate change together, really thinking about governance as a way to manage climate change. The other one in vertical accountability is about a citizen engagement platform that called Valulato. And then at the bottom, the horizontal collaboration one that has actually been about bringing sense making as a capability to the public service as a whole. And so what, having a portfolio visual like that, what it actually allows us to have, and this is the final iteration, is actually to review ongoingly and map out ongoingly how does your portfolio change over time. And what this allowed for the portfolio manager, Agnes Chambiri, to have was actually to have different types of conversations at the level of the whole. So it literally helped her, and that's probably the use of any type of strategic visualization, is actually to help to have a specific type of conversation, not to visualize the system as is. And that helped her to have conversations with projects that were getting at those edges, at those collaboration possibilities with other projects, helping her to kind of lift up as well and speak from the perspective of the portfolio, the interest of the whole, rather than individual kind of lines and divisions in the organization. And that was actually a test for us. We didn't know how something like that would come across to a senior manager in Malawi. We didn't know if that would make sense for her, how she would use that. And the fact that this visual even continues and evolved over time really comes from her feedback that she said, I need these things, continue making these things for me, because that's how I make sense of what I do. That's how I make sense of where I want to go with the portfolio. Right. And that gets us to the third step, right? I was already mentioning in the beginning, making sense is not something that happens once, so the value of that will be fairly little. You would want to get into a habit of actually repeating that over and over again, getting into a habit of using sense making as a collective wayfinding and decision-making moment. So that's what we did in the last phase of the project. Here, that project went from January to October 2021, and we ran sense making 3 times. And what you see here in the back is those 3 sense making workshops and how the outputs of one became the object of sense making in the next one. Now we gradually expanded almost the scope of what we made sense of. And I think that scope from going from coordination within a single organization, so coordination within the UNDP, all the way through policy proposition that brings together governance and digitalization was only possible on account of actually doing this ongoingly and adapting the design of the sense-making workshops. But so what we focused on in this session was actually to start to make those feedback loops between making sense, having insights that come out of it, and taking action to start and narrow that down against all organizational muscles and habits, because we actually all don't like to take decisions, right? We all don't like to change. So what we're trying to find out is, well, how can we actually get quicker into action learning, do sense making, get into action? And the way that we did this was that we probably made it a little bit leaner, so that whatever comes out of that is not a heavy strategic argument at that point, but it actually almost becomes a light impulse for people to change and try something new. Again, something that doesn't give you a sense of what's the solution, what do you need to do, but something that says, well, so this is what we observed about your project, your work. Why don't you go and try this? Why don't you do these 3 things? And then the next sense, we can come back and tell us how that went. What did you experience? What did you learn? What worked? What didn't work? So really getting into experimentation a little bit quicker, easier, faster. One of the examples that actually came out of the very first sense making that came back as an impulse and were implemented was the idea of clusters. So typically, people work in their project lines. They might be across a couple of projects, but they'll stay within the project. What they understood, and the portfolio manager was really driving that, was that they needed to work more as a team of teams if they wanted to be quicker. That goes back to this question of how do we accelerate or how do we scale change? Literally sometimes through coordinating quicker with each other. And so rather than making sense once every 3 months, how do they make sense constantly throughout specific divisions? And so the clusters that they developed here actually, they come back through those positions that we designed from the beginning. So those cubes, the lateral, thing about climate, something about horizontal collaboration, and something about citizen accountability. And that was actually something really new, and I think for many of our organizations, it's still something we're all working on as well. Interestingly, these clusters actually became, so tied to these clusters was almost a new level of management or a new level of people management. Because suddenly you needed to have people who could coordinate those clusters, but not be managers of others, but actually be facilitators of learning. So really created a different development pathway for people within the organization that was centered around learning and the value for the portfolio as a whole. What we focused on here was also the enabling environment. So here we worked more closely with the team, with the portfolio manager and her advisors, to actually think through the ins and outs of portfolio sense making and the whole portfolio lifecycle. So really going back to their typical governance arrangements, management planning arrangements of when do you create a 4-year program structure? When do you review that in 2 years' time? Where are there, at any point of those life cycles, moments where you can change? Because of course we're all stuck, be that a log frame, be that something else. We all have clear terms of reference. But typically there's always an opportunity, there's a committee meeting, there's a steering meeting, any other type of meeting, where there's an opportunity to break that up and to create a new shared sense of what matters and to actually change the course of the entire project. And the specific thing that the team pointed out or took out here was connecting sense making to something that they call annual steering committees, which are inter-organizational, intergovernmental meetings where the project meets with the government partners, donors, UNDP, other development partners, and almost reports on an annual basis. And what happened over time was that these meetings became a little bit like tick box exercises. And I think we all know these types of experiences in our organizations. They were probably designed at some point in time to actually enable exactly that, to make a change, to ask for something more, to ask for something different. But because you need to prepare well for meetings like this, you need to have not just information prepared, but you need to have a compelling strategic argument that probably doesn't just come from your experience, but actually you have a backup of multiple people's experience about this, because typically this will be emergent knowledge. This is not the type of information that you'll find in the books or from an external consultant, but the knowledge that these projects have available is really emergent. So you need something that helps you to bring this argument across. And that's where sensemaking actually comes in. So to help them to say, look, we need to find this as our own intervention point in our system, because that's where we are flexible. That's where we can create a difference. That's where we're not stuck to our project lines. And that's something that they ended up doing as well. And then the last point is, and I'm bringing us back to this picture, to the policy proposition. As you see, we experimented here with sense-making in different scales and different levels. Within the organization, in the next one, we actually invited government partners and development partners, starting to make sense across the different governance portfolios that were there. And then in the last sense-making workshop, we actually started to make sense of the governance initiatives and portfolios, the Vision 2063, the new vision that the Malawi government put up, and the digitalization efforts of the UNDP, government, and others. And that primarily came as an insight from the bridge sense-making, where we realized, well, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of political will, interest in the digitalization space. So if we link up governance and digitalization in a way that works, we can actually use a lot of that energy and feed that back into the change that we want to see in governance. And I think at this level, thinking through how can actually sense-making create resolutions about cross-cutting issues, cross-cutting development topics, but also across many organizations, and at the level of government, that's really the type of resolutions in the shared sense that matters for system transformation. So what you see on this picture is Agnes, one of her junior analysts. Agnes was a portfolio manager. She has since moved on to be the permanent representative of Malawi to the UN, so that she transitioned in December last year. And I think I just wanted to point that out, that in the end, it's really people who make change. And I've been primarily kind of speaking about the project, not mentioning anyone's, but I'm very clearly aware that without the leadership of Agnes and without her kind of conviction to bring change to where it actually matters, we wouldn't have gone far. Nor without the sponsorship of her bosses, Shigeki Kumatsubara and Claire Medina. Claire Medina was the DRR and Shigeki is still the representative of the UNDP. And I think we were just very lucky to some extent to have been able to draw on their excellent example of leadership there. Some of the outcomes, you might read through them. I'm not going to go through them in detail. I mentioned already some of the projects have been implemented. They've been receiving acknowledgement not just from the UNDP, from the government, but also we've been receiving acknowledgement from Achim Steiner, so the head of the UNDP himself. We have the National Planning Committee in Malawi who are looking to think through how sense-making and foresight thinking can be brought together to challenges about governance and climate. And the strategic plan that the UNDP put together for themselves for 2025 actually recognizes the portfolio approach, so that design of learning options, development options, and to draw from there an emergent sense of system action, system change. Has been acknowledged as a key strategic capability for the UNDP globally. And so some of the other projects that we work on are actually trying to build that beyond Malawi with the UNDP. And I think that's already it. That's just a quote from Agnes. She always has been talking about sense-making as a discipline, probably because we just go at it very disciplined and it's very structural. And her just personal conviction of actually bringing that into the spaces and conversations that she is in across public and private stakeholders.
Super. Thank you very much. Yeah, so questions.
So
Go ahead.
Roger. You made reference to sense making different scales, different levels, and you're also referring to embedding an ongoing sense making capability rather than it being these sort of, sporadic. Let's go make some sense and then back to the day job. Let's make some sense and back to the day job.
Yeah.
So you're painting a picture there of embedding an ongoing sense making capability, multiple levels. To what extent were you also thinking about the interactions, almost building a network of sense making that is in communication with itself, sort of up and down and across the thing? Was that part of what you were doing?
That would have been amazing. I mean, that's the ultimate question that we're asking ourselves, even like literally thinking about how do you make sense across organizations and across domains? Like if we thinking about scale and thinking about kind of system transformation at scale, that actually means a different way of making sense at the in-betweens of all of our organizations. Are we there? No, we'll definitely, that's what we're interested in terms of getting there. I think in this project, because it was so new, and that what organizations probably do to manage the risk of something new is actually to contain it a little bit. So I would say that still remained quite contained. And that looking, the next step for them is actually saying, okay, how do we do this now with the next portfolio? How do we start doing that at the level of the entire country office? Right, we're really just in the governance portfolio, which is just one unit. And I think that actually, and this was a 2-year-long program, right? But it gives you a sense of how long does it actually take to kind of massage the system and get in there.
Do you have Stafford Beer's viable system model in your thinking?
If we have a viable system.
Viable system model, does that mean anything to you? Because I imagine you're building a system for a set of system 4 nodes here in Stafford Beer's language of organisation. The reason I asked the question about networking them together is that I have a friend who's very into the BSA, and she always says you need to network, you need to build a system for a network, and you've got this intelligence network. Feed in.
The cybernetic,
Yeah.
I think the whole thing's like a framework for connecting across in the sense making as you're talking about there, but it's also the collaboration across those projects too. So this is kind of the ultimate measure of the whole thing, how well you manage to get those collaborations to form. Because obviously those projects are happening already, right? They're running those, and your framework here is all about how do we get them making sense together, as you're talking about there, and then working together towards systems change. And that's kind of the ultimate measure. Do those collaborations happen? Are they successful and so forth? You get a sense that this fosters those collaborations in the way that it wouldn't otherwise? Or?
So I think it definitely fosters collaborations in another way, just because it changes probably the type of instructions people get back. So probably sense making is that type of a place where the types of actions that you get are actually taking you off track from your project. You'd be like, well, that's not my plan. That's not something that I budgeted for, that I have plans for, time for. So they literally ask you to stop your action. And I guess because it happens at a whole portfolio level, let's say anyone needs to stop their action for a certain bit of time, it gives you an opportunity to actually catch on to someone else and work with them. Because I think what we tend to forget is human systems and time, right? Sometimes it's a time question. How do we create these time spaces for different decisions that we can also take? So I definitely think sense making creates a time window. And in the end, it is reliant on people's mindsets. Some people's mindsets kind of thrive in that. Others will feel more defensive, probably, because that's not how they have been doing things.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely a little bit of a discrepancy. Some people are over here and others are still there. So catching that up in terms of collaboration, sometimes it can increase the collaboration gap because of that. Of course, like any new thing that comes into an organization, but it also allows the people who are actually latching onto it to recognize each other, and I think for those people, there's definitely a lot of momentum for collaboration.
Cool. Questions? Yeah.
And thanks, Amelia. It was a really great presentation, really wonderful to hear my name's Alan Wilson. So I guess my question was, when you talked about the design of portfolios, one term that you didn't use, but I thought it seemed was basically a learning agenda or learning questions. So I wondered whether when you're thinking about designing a portfolio, you have in mind a series of learning questions or the learning agenda. Because I mean, in the kind of the conversations I'm in, they would use that kind of language, like with USAID. They would talk about what's the learning agenda that we're doing. And so I wondered whether that's kind of in your mind, or do you see that as something different from your approach to portfolio design?
I guess somewhere in between there. So the learning agenda would assume that you know what you need to learn.
Mhm.
So probably we would question that you know what you need to learn.
Yeah.
So the agenda definitely might give you reference points, and that is good enough. So whatever gives you enough reference points to go out there and have the experience, I'm all for it. There's probably something about it, that turns it into a tick box exercise rather than an exploration exercise about learning agenda. So the way that we go about the portfolio design is what you have at the end is a portfolio brief, and that will have a very specified sense of what's the strategic position, where do you want to go in the system, what's the rationale for you to go there, and what do you want to learn. But that learning might be fairly broad. So the learning might be for one of these is how can we apply governance, how can we make governance relevant to climate change is one of the positions in here. So that is not your typical probably learning agenda. It still leaves a lot of agency up to the individual and a lot of sense making that it almost forces you to go through, because it's not saying, what are the three things that matter here.
Any other questions?
I was wondering, I've been looking into the different ways people visualize portfolios. I noticed Cora is using cubes to visualize the portfolios, which gives you three dimensions. Why is it three relevant?
Yeah, I can move over there.
Actually, I was going to ask, just tag on to that question, like where do those parameters also come from? Like where do they come from?
So the parameters come from our understanding of kind of how social systems are structured all together, from a strategic perspective to decision making in social systems. So typically there will be something about how decisions are taken, how information flows in a system, how it builds up to meaning and identity. It will have a component about the social experience of the problem or of the system. And it will have a component about the resources that the system has available to itself to make decisions, to make things happen for itself. And then there's, this design process actually then has elements of design thinking, human-centered design. There's personas work, all the way through to research, which we call reconnaissance. So this might well take you 3 to 8 months to develop the portfolio. There's a lot of almost knowledge generation happens for the team as ongoing making sense of the problem. That's where these things come from. And in terms of why we decided to use a more three-dimensional representation of the system was probably because if you go back to neuroscience and to systems thinking and thinking in complexity, our brains are a lot more drawn to thinking in space rather than thinking in complexity or in complicated structures. And something that we actually care about, just like with sense making, we don't use systems thinking that often in our work because we are actually really looking to draw on the innate human capability to make sense of the world. And something about space opens up a whole different type of conversation. We think of opportunity spaces, we think of the multiple dimensions in the space, and it also helps us to almost think systemically straight away, because the space is a combination of many things. You can think relationally in the space. And that's really why three-dimensional cube. And so what we actually do then in practice, this is just a 2D representation, but in practice we actually have a three-dimensional cube that you can move, flick things on and off, you can turn it upside down, you can try different perspectives around that. You can double click it, it opens up, every position opens up almost its own trove of reference material, knowledge, and insights.
Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, one last one, 2 more. No, you go first.
have a skeptical type of question. I have followed the presentation, I know the methodology, and I see that on one side there is a kind of a consistent heavy load of terminology, okay, that flows over the presentation. And on the other side, like the problem space, you have this kind of metaphoric way of conceptualizing the portfolio, 3D with this kind of layers, and in each axis you have at least 4 or 5 terms. Okay. And on the other side, we have Malawi, and you explained that there's countries corruption there, and the UNDP and the funding. So I just wondering, at any stage of the process, you do any kind of risk assessment that you are actually promoting a self-fulfilling prophecy, that there is a portfolio or a problem space where actually there's no portfolio problem space, because in between the complexity of the terminology and the visual metaphor, you are working in a country like Malawi. Okay, so there is this kind of intersection about managing portfolios in this kind of complex way in a country with this kind of complexity somehow, with this intersection with funding. So I wonder if there is any kind of awareness exercise or risk assessment to understand what is going on here with narrative that we are
So I think this is like any type of project, this is standard risk assessment process also for us. Definitely a very strong risk assessment process on the UNDP side, I think in any type of program. What we are definitely very aware about, and what we always flag in our work, is that any type of system representation will always be an abstraction, and it's really just a narrative. We're not representing the system as it is. I'm not saying this is Malawi, not at all. If you want to go to Malawi, you need to take a plane, sit on the plane, travel to Malawi, and like put yourself on the road, literally in the country. So, but I'd also argue you don't need to represent Malawi, nor is there probably a way to represent Malawi to actually take an action in it that gives you sufficient terms of reference for being strategic in doing that. So what this actually just does is it oversimplifies very grossly what matters about us here, us being the UNDP. So there's more UNDP in here than there's Malawi in here in a way, right? Because what we're trying to do with the visualizations is to say, well, the problem is not out there, but we need to find a way to put our mental images of the problem, our picture of the problem, the shared sense, in front of us so that we can take decisions about us. Because if it's not in front of us, it's actually driving us from behind, right? You need to find a way to put that in the front. And I think that's the actual risk. If it stays in the back of a system of an organization and it's driving it, rather than you make it an object of decision making. And that's what we're trying, why that spatial representation matters, is because it is an object. And if we work with decisions, we actually are working with information, with language, with metaphors. None of that has any tangibility to itself. So actually making it tangible, I think, forces us every now and then to exactly ask these questions. What do we see? And is this what we're actually wanting to drive here? And definitely agree with you, there's always, in any type of conversation about a system, there's always a risk. And self-fulfilling prophecies, I think, are common quality of human systems.
It's a tool, right? When you recognize it, so you're able to check those influences and
Yes,
remind
yeah,
you're not
absolutely.
confused.
Yeah. So putting something there that will actually exactly have this type of conversation, like, well, citizen participation, why is it even there? What do you mean by that? Why does it matter for us? So that's exactly it. It should be provocative.
I was curious to hear more about the clusters that you said sort of emerged as a thing to create as part of the process. Can you tell a bit more what you did? What was the cluster? Who was on it? What they did? Whether it's a temporary forum or something that can last and become a permanent or semi-permanent way of affecting change?
So I don't know if it lasted. I haven't been in touch with the team just now. I know when we last were there, it was definitely just being put into place. And the way that it worked was to put the different projects that were kind of close to a position, to have one of the project managers who were closely engaged in the portfolio design, more engaged in the sense making, almost displayed some of those qualities already, to put them in a coordination or in a kind of leadership role, actually. So it was a bit of a primus inter pares approach to leadership here. I think for each cluster, they had sometimes 2 to 3 projects. And so what I did notice was over time, in the second and third sense making, that projects would get allocated to it. So they definitely used this. It wasn't a static arrangement, but it was literally saying, okay, so there's someone new in the landscape. You need to go and bring that person in. And I think the way that the terms of reference and principles that we designed together, there's also not meant to be a kind of just the UNDP cluster, right? But the idea of that was, how do we actually almost create attractors for people that are working in a similar field of practice with the same stakeholders, maybe on similar issues that are tangential to what we do. So we can try to understand, just exchange our own kind of intelligence. What are we learning here? What's working? If they've done that step to now work across organizations, I don't know. But I definitely say they're in the learning mode of how can they make that happen.
Great. We'll wrap up there and take some tea. Thank you very much. Tea, coffee outside, you can go upstairs, the lovely space upstairs. You can check. If you want to join for a meal, we'll be having a meal by around 6 o'clock. You'll find the info in that group of the impact. So.